What comes to mind when you hear the word bats? Do you automatically think about Hollywood horror movies? Or are you reminded of the important role these flying mammals play in our ecosystem? Hi, I'm Kathy Mueller, host of Wild About Wildlife, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes at Salthaven Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education Center. In this episode, I sit down with two volunteer members of Salthaven's Bat Squad. Kathy Bear and Megan Clark help dispel the bad rap bats get and explain why we should all be installing bat boxes and encouraging them to live in our communities. Let's get started. Well, thank you, Kathy and Megan, for joining me today. I think a good place to start, before we get into the whole bat thing, let's learn a little bit about you guys as members of the Bat Squad. What's your background? How did you get involved in the Bat Squad? Let's start with you, Kathy.
So I have been involved with the Bat Squad for over 10 years now, prior to it actually being considered a Bat Squad. And I actually got started with bats more as a matter of convenience, I think, than anything else. One of our other volunteers was looking for someone to give her a hand one day with the bats. And since I was actually able to handle bats, I got asked to do it. And it's just, I fell in love with bats pretty much right there and then. And so I have been working with them since then.
And did you have any history working with bats prior to coming to Salthaven?
No, other than, living at a farm and seeing them flying around, I was a little bit nervous of working with them. So it took a little bit of time to get comfortable with them.
Megan, how about you? How long have you been involved? When did you get involved?
I started with the Bat Squad in 2019, so I'm going into my fifth season with them. And I had originally been a volunteer in the clinic, and one of the Bat Squad volunteers had talked about the Bat Squad, and at that time they were in need of some volunteers. I had seen a bat just kind of at a glance when I'd gone into one of the trailers, and it caught my curiosity. And at the end of our regular clinic season, I felt I didn't want to end. I wanted to continue, and so the Bat Squad, as we know, goes throughout the winter and the spring. And it was something I jumped on board with. I got my vaccination, and like Kathy, I was a little bit nervous to handle them, but more so because they're just so small. They're fragile. They're not as fragile as maybe we think they are, but they're definitely different than handling other animals that we see in the clinic.
And so, what does the Bat Squad do?
We rehabilitate bats. We take them in from, anywhere from late October, early November. Sometimes our season starts in December, but it goes all the way up until May and June. We take them in. We basically just provide them a nice, warm, cozy, safe environment. We feed them, we check on their health, and prepare them for release in the spring.
And Kathy, what are some of the reasons why the bats are coming to Salthaven in the first place?
So there's a variety of reasons. Throughout the summer, we will get the odd phone call for bats. Not very often. It tends to be at that point that they're rather sick or they have some sort of injury. But in the fall and winter, a lot of times what's happened is they just weren't able to get into a safe location, either for their hibernation or we do have some bats in Ontario that are migratory species, and maybe they didn't make their migration on time. And these are the ones that, once our winter shows up, there's no food for the bats to eat, and the temperatures are too cold. So we need to find, as Megan said, somewhere to put them.
Migratory bats, and then there are non-migratory bats here in Ontario, and they can withstand our winters? Or like what happens to the ones who are used to being here in Ontario through the winter? Do they basically just hunker down and hibernate, or what do they do?
That's basically an accurate representation. For most of the species that we have staying in Ontario, they are considered crevice dwelling bats. So, they will be hunkering down in a winter roost, whether that's in a building or in crevices like rock crevices, caves, are another place that they go. So they are able to withstand those lower temperatures. They tend to be in groups, there's clustering. So their temperatures, they don't get to a point where they freeze to death, but their temperatures do get quite low. And I think if, and Megan, correct me, I believe they can get their temperatures down to about 4 degrees in their core and still survive that winter.
Yeah, definitely. They also have the ability to lower their heart rate, lower their breathing. So it's not that their body stops functioning; it just stops functioning at such a high rate so that they are able to use those fat reserves that they've built up over their summer season, rely on them during their torpor.
That was going to be my next question. What do they survive on? Obviously, if they're existing at a much lower level, they're not going to need the same kind of food that they would during their active season, but they still need some sort of nourishment. And are they solely relying then on their fat reserves?
Yes, yes, they fatten up quite well before the beginning of their torpor season. And to add to what Kathy said before, I think sometimes the reason we see them is because they didn't fatten up enough. And during their torpor, they do often wake up, every 3 to 4 weeks, they'll wake up and move around depending, how warm it is in their roost. And when they do wake up, they burn some of those fat reserves faster than when they're actually hibernating. And if they didn't gain enough weight in the beginning of their season, they will lose that weight a lot quicker. And sometimes that's also why we'll find them in care.
And what sort of bats do you get?
There are 8 species in Ontario. We generally see about 5 of those 8. So, the most common bat that we have in care is the big brown bat, but we have seen a hoary bat, silver haired bats, a little brown bat.
You had that very, very cute red eastern bat with her pups. Eastern red, sorry.
Oh yes, yes, the eastern red. Those are another one. Beautiful. They're really. I mean, for people who don't really understand bats, they are absolutely gorgeous bats.
Okay, so you mentioned the big brown bat, and to me, that's a little bit of a misnomer. That, like, it seems like it's incorrectly named because they're actually tiny. They're the well, correct me if I'm wrong, but are they the ones that typically end up flying around in people's houses?
Yes, and I believe the big brown bat is it the second largest bat? I believe ahead of the big brown bat for size is the hoary bat, if I'm correct. So yeah, they aren't very big, but for the bat, the microbats, they are bigger.
One of the things that people have is a misconception in their head is that we're looking at what we see in other countries, the flying foxes, the fruit bats, you know, larger bats. But these are, in Ontario, we have what, as Megan was saying, are considered microbats.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the bad rap that bats get. Probably the different horror movies and that don't help, but there seems to be a lot of misperceptions about bats in general. People like you probably get raised eyebrows when you say, "Oh yeah, you volunteer and look after bats." Like it would be the last thing that a lot of people would want to be doing.
And Megan probably hears a little bit more of the stories about this, but I think one of the biggest ones that we hear is that they worry that the bats are going to fly into their hair. And the truth is the bat wants to be nowhere near you. Horror movies, yeah, are the biggest reason, but even some of the ads that we've seen in the past, or uh, some media posts where they really do kind of make them sound like.
They kind of villainize them. It's a bit of a shame when you see that in movies, like Bram Stoker's Dracula. A lot of people will ask me, what do the bats eat? And when I say, in Canada here, they're eating bugs, and in some other countries they're eating fruit. There is a very small population that do drink blood, but it's very minimal, and so people are quite surprised when they hear that the bats are eating bugs. They really do think that, oh, they're bloodsuckers, and that's why they have that misperception that they're trying to attack me and they're trying to get in my hair. And it's really, like Kathy said, they want nothing to do with us. Like most wildlife, they do not want to be around us. They don't want to be handled. They much prefer to live their own bat life, free from humans.
And I think part of it might have to do with just the way that they fly, right? It seems to be very erratic, and they swoop down, they'll come close. That could scare a lot of people, right?
Definitely got the acrobatics, the aerial acrobatics down quite well. And the one thing that we really enjoy is we have in the past year we had built a new flight pen for our bats, which was a huge achievement, I think, for us at Salthaven. And it's a 10 foot by 20 foot enclosure, and we are allowed to get the bats flying in there. And you really do get to see a lot of that erratic flight is trying to swoop after bugs. Bugs do not tend to fly in straight lines either, and the bats really are going after that. So it's pretty impressive to watch them.
Talking about this flight pen, when the bats are at Salthaven, then do they go into this hibernation like state as well? Is that what you try and mimic, but in a controlled setting? Or are they active throughout the winter?
Currently, we're not torpouring our bats. We are in need of some equipment to do so. Right now, they basically they come in. They live in rather large enclosures together, so that they're not alone, and they spend their whole winter in those enclosures. Come spring, when the weather starts to be favorable for them, we will put them out in the flight pen to kind of condition them, because much the same as humans, if we sat on the sofa all winter and then we wanted to just immediately go for a run, we're going to struggle. So same for the bats. If they've been in an enclosure awake, they do have some muscle atrophy, and it's kind of understandable that if we were just to release them, that they might struggle a bit. So we do want to put them out in that flight pen, trial them, and then condition them based on their presentation, and just give them that extra boost before we do release them.
So let's try and put some of those misperceptions to rest. Let's talk about the good that bats do for our environment. I don't know who wants to start us off on that one.
The primary thing that I think people really need to understand about bats is the impact that they have just in local ecology. They eat. They can say as much as their weight in insects in an evening, which is huge. I mean, none of us can do that. But if you think about the impact, we have diseases like West Nile virus, things like that. If the mosquitoes are out there, if the bats are going after those, they're bringing down those populations, reducing the risks of that. There's a lot of documentation out there really recording the good that bats do, even for crop control for insects. They do eat a lot of beetles that affect a lot of our crops. You cannot underestimate the good that they do.
In Canada, the main great reason to have bats is for pest control. I know in other countries and other species of bats, they are also pollinators, something similar to what bees do, except that they eat seeds and they spread seeds and stuff like that. But here in Canada, it is mainly about pest control, mosquitoes, crop destruction, stuff like that.
The current bat population in Ontario, in Canada, is it strong? Are they threatened in any way? Their existence threatened in any way?
Some species in Ontario are endangered. Our little brown bat is endangered. Kathy, you'll have to help me out on this. I believe it's the long-eared bat is endangered. Our big brown bat population, the one that we see the most at Salthaven, is not endangered, but they still do suffer from some of the effects of habitat destruction. There's also white nose syndrome. There's climate change, lots of aspects that are impacting bats' health and their longevity.
And what are you noticing with climate change? Any kind of trend? Is it too early to say yet how that's impacting the bats?
Well, this season we are seeing bats come in earlier and in more volume. This year, as we were talking earlier, we have 18 bats currently in care, which is, I think, Kathy, is almost three times the amount we would typically have at this time of the season. And that could be due to our very mild winter that we've had up until now.
Well, when we were talking about things like climate change, I think other populations in different areas of the country are certainly seeing a big impact. Down in the States last year, there was a big freeze in Houston. That just resulted in such a fast drop in temperature that bats were literally falling out of their roosts onto the ground to be saved. Areas where there's more drought, there's less water for the bats, there's less insects, so that there's more of them starving to death, things like that. If they don't get those body weights up the first year for a bat, that first winter is the highest risk for bats to not be able to survive under normal circumstances because they don't necessarily have enough weight on them. So, if you start talking about them not being able to torpor properly, then yeah, I think we're going to see a pretty big impact on our bat populations. And at this point, 50% of the species in Ontario is on the endangered list. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room. We really do need to help these populations.
I guess what are the ramifications if we don't?
I think we're going to spend as a country a lot more money on crop pesticides. Like the amount of money that bats save the industry is in the millions and billions. It's a lot of money goes towards pesticides already for crops. If we eliminated bats or reduce their numbers, we're going to spend a lot more.
You've both talked about how the bats eat a lot of insects. What are you feeding them over the winter when they're at Salthaven?
So at Salthaven, primarily the diet are mealworms, and those are ones. Megan actually has a wonderful supplement blend that we have so that we can gut load these mealworms. They eat the supplements that we've given them, and those supplements in turn are eaten by our bats, and that mimics more of what they need in their diet in order to survive. I think we've trialed crickets a couple of times. They're not so interested in that. If a bat is really weak, we do stick to a liquid diet for them in order to get their calories up and the fat up, just to get them a little bit more stable.
And I understand too that at some points along the way, probably almost every season, you end up with a bat that's pregnant.
We do. Yeah, and it seems every year we become more successful with pups being born. Bats they typically become pregnant or gestated in the fall, and then it's when they wake up from their torpor in the spring and the conditions are more favorable, they're warmer, bugs are plentiful, they have their maternity roosts, and so something in their ecology will say, hey, let's continue on with this pregnancy, and they will gestate, or their pregnancy will continue, and yeah, the pups will be born. In the wild, they're typically born in late May to June, but with us, depending on when they come in, and depending on if they were pregnant when they came in, they can be pregnant or have their pups as early as March. I think that's been our earliest cohort of pups being born was March.
So what, it's like a couple of months gestation period, or how long is that?
With our big brown bats, I believe it's somewhere between 50 to 60 days. So we can often track them by their weight. We're not always accurate, but definitely their weight is a great indication. There's some physical examinations that we can do to help us determine, but it really comes down to just monitoring them and watching them. When the birth is imminent, there are some other signs that we can watch for to kind of give us clues that they're ready to give birth.
And what are bats like as parents? Like, do they both play, mom and dad both play equal roles? How long are the pups allowed to stay along before they're kicked out of the proverbial nest, so to speak?
So it's interesting that, as big brown bats basically will roost together throughout the year until they get into the spring, and then the females will create these maternity roosts, these maternity colonies, and there will be many bats that get together, and it is all the females. The males at this point have, they're not in the picture at all, but these females will give birth, and they're incredibly supportive of each other. They will look after their other pups. Mom goes out to go hunting, there's other bats there to kind of look after the pups. That's actually, totally different than what people seem to think in their heads. And pups, Megan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the pups generally learn to fly between 4 and 6 weeks of age. And my understanding is they will stay with them until, the next spring when we go back into the maternity colonies where, again, maybe daughters are with moms, who knows, but there's no kicking out of a nest as far as I understand.
Yeah, it's my understanding that 75% of the females born will stay with their mom in that maternity roost. Typically, the males, as Kathy said, after that first season, when maternity time comes, they typically leave the roost and don't return. Whether it's known if they actually return in the fall to that roost or not, it's kind of hard to track. And you are right, they are flying between 4 to 6 weeks. And during that learning to fly is also when they start to transition to an adult diet. So that's when they begin the weaning process as well. So they'll still stick with mom, fly with her, learn to hunt, and then they just slowly become efficient as well.
Okay, let's talk about bat personalities because you've both seen hundreds of bats over the course of your time with Salthaven. Do they have different personalities? What are those personalities like?
Oh man, we have encountered some really sassy bats, and we've encountered some really agreeable, docile bats. It's very interesting to see that they really do have individual personalities. Even if you get two sassy bats, they're different. They're sassy for different reasons. Some of them are very vocal and they're content to tell you, how it is and what they want and what they don't want. And then there's others that are just very chill and laid back, and you examine them. And I mean, most bats don't typically like having their wings opened up to be inspected, but we get the odd bat that just doesn't really seem to mind that we are inspecting them, brushing them, handling them quite a bit.
It's interesting because, on that same event, if a bat is very content, they actually vibrate. It's basically a bat version of purring, which is a lot of, you just feel kind of good. Okay, we're doing the right thing here. The bat's content with us. That's okay. On the other hand, just like people, they all have different personalities. Some are outgoing, some are, want to be alone. Some of them, love to be with their cohorts. Others like to be beside their cohort, so really a lot like people. And you do get to know, looking at these bats, if you didn't know which bat was which, a lot of times that personality is something that you can use to identify an individual bat.
Right. And actually, that's a good point because quite often, and not just with the bats at Salthaven, but say there are five goslings that all come in. And so there are little colors that are put on top of their head. And just for our listeners, that is non toxic paint, right? And it's simply as a way to be able to tell who is who.
Yeah, we do the same thing with the bats. They each get their own individual color, but sometimes that color wears off. They're expert cleaners. They're self-grooming quite a bit. They spend a lot of their time grooming. And so sometimes when we arrive, they've managed to get most of the paint off. And it's lucky for us that we can typically rely on their personality, some of their vocalizations or just the way they move in your hand or respond to ourselves.
So you must each have a favorite bat story that you tell at, it's your favorite party trick kind of thing. What a favorite bat story that you have from your time at Salthaven?
There are a lot to pick from. I would say that the one that's really stuck with me most was a silver bat, silverhead bat that we got in several years ago. And it's not so much that it was something specifically unique about their stay with us, but it was more about her personality. She was very sassy. She was quite vocal, would let you know that she wasn't really impressed with things that you did. But I like to feel that she and I actually had a bit of a rapport. We got along quite well. And it's just one of those ones that you just have a real soft spot for.
And I would guess that's a pretty or more of a rare occurrence to have that kind of a bat at the clinic.
As far as the silver-haired bat, yes. As far as, the rapport, I think bats do identify the people that are working with them. So they do recognize you, and they, as the season goes on, I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for.
Is it like building a trust? You're building that relationship and a trust?
Yeah, I think that would be a lot of what it is. There is a lot of trust, and I think with some bats that comes very quickly, with others it takes time. With some bats it just doesn't happen.
And Megan, what's your story?
Oh gosh. So a couple of years ago, we had a female come in the very beginning of the season. She was one of our first, if not the first, and that season we had a lot of boys coming in initially, and so we generally keep the boys and the females separated. We had this female on her own because we weren't getting any females in, and it took about, I think, 6 weeks before we got our first female. I was growing a bit concerned that she was going to be depressed and that she was kind of showing signs of just a general malaise. And so we finally had gotten a female in, and when we were able to introduce her, this new female, had climbed up the enclosure wall to meet the older female in care, and the older female literally opened up her wing and took in this newer female, and immediately was just kind of on top of her, grooming her, sniffing her from head to toe. And I left them to kind of get to know one another, and when I peeked in on them, half an hour later, they were just snuggled up. She was just enclosed in the other bat's wings. It was just the sweetest thing to see, this instant acceptance and friendship. So I think that's one of my favorite moments with the Bat Squad.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's absolutely precious. Okay, so before we wrap things up, for our listeners out there, they get a bat in their house. They're running around frantically. Everybody seems to get out a broom or something to start with. How do people get a bat out of the house? What's the best way?
It depends on the time of year. If it is winter, we don't want you releasing it outside. That bat, it's a certain death for the bat here in Canada if you release the bat outside during late fall, winter, and early spring. So we recommend that you definitely give us a call. We can give you advice over the phone. But I think first and foremost, just stop, take a breath, don't panic. Just know that this bat is more scared than you are, and it is definitely trying to be away from you. It's looking for a safe place to land and be safe.
The main thing in this time of year would be if you could get a box or a container and place it over top of the bat is the main thing. And then slip a piece of paper, similar, you see a lot of people capturing bugs this way to release them outside. It's basically the same thing, where you're covering it up and you're sliding a piece of cardboard or paper over top of it so that you've captured the bat without handling it. And that's one of the key things that we would also want people to do, is never handle a bat with bare hands. If you've got a pair of leather gloves, something to protect you, because they do bite. And rabies is always a risk with these kinds of bats, a very low risk, but it is still a risk. So we do want people to be safe when they're handling them. During the summer months, we can recommend that you open up doors and windows. The bat wants to be out, the bat does not want to be there. So it's looking for its way out. That would help it. But like Megan said, wintertime is the death sentence for them. So that would be the main way, is if you can cover them with a container and then collect them into a box that's secured, and then call a wildlife rehab center for further advice.
And then, in terms of helping to conserve and preserve the bat population, what's something that the average homeowner could do?
In Canada, everyone is encouraged to have a bat box. If you can have a bat box, build a bat box. There's instructions online. You can build them, instructions on how to post them and what to watch for. That's the biggest thing. There are sites that collect that data on whether or not you have a bat house, whether you're seeing bats, and that's all in an attempt to understand more about bat behavior, bat populations, because that's the best way that we can learn to conserve our bat populations, is to understand more about them.
Yeah, in some of the research I was doing before we started chatting, I came across the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and that they actually have a site online where you can go and report a bat sighting. So explain a little bit about why that's important.
So this is more again about understanding our populations of bats. So there's a few things we want to know: which bats are being seen, how many bats are being seen. It tells us a little bit tracking what kind of roost they're looking for. It also helps to understand what it is that appeals to a bat about a bat house. Is it the color? Is it the location? Is it the direction that it's facing? Things like that. And again, these sightings as they're being logged in is collecting data so that research is being done to understand these natural populations, because the more we learn, the more that we can help figure out plans on how to help conserve these populations and to boost them. We touched earlier on things like white nose syndrome, but other things that are really impacting the bats in our society right now are destruction of their natural habitat. Climate change is definitely, we're seeing an effect in areas on that. And additionally, things, ironically, wind turbines have quite an impact on our bats as well. And there's research being done to help support bat populations during migration seasons, for example, so that they try to avoid having some wind turbines running during certain migration times to hopefully reduce impact on bats.
Okay, so is it, and the with the wind turbines, is it literally bats were flying into the wind turbines? Is that what's happening?
There's a really big pressure gradient as those turbines are turning. So it's not even so much that the bats are actually hitting the turbines so much as the pressure on the air actually implodes their little lungs. It's unfortunate, but that is kind of where things are at. And again, some companies are actually working toward different ways of dealing with that to help avoid those kinds of interactions.
And then with the bats that are coming into Salthaven, is Salthaven as an organization reporting that information into the Canadian Wildlife Federation, or like are we contributing to that research as well?
Not directly. We do have to report to the ministry every year of what wildlife is being brought into Salthaven. So, with that, every bat is being reported that we are bringing in. So, species, gender, all of those things are all being recorded.
I think we can leave it there for now. Thank you so much, both of you, Megan and Kathy, for joining me today. And I'll let you have the last word. What's your message to our listeners about bats?
Bats are amazing, and they're absolutely not what you think they are. They are altruistic, they are gentle, they are wild, and they are free. They have their own personalities. They may not look like a cute furry bunny or a baby duck, but they are just little bundles of energy and joy, and to be able to experience seeing one is just a privilege, really. I think to see one out in the wild, we should be super happy because the numbers are declining. And so to be able to see one is just, amazing. They're great animals.
That's pretty much what I would be saying too. One of the greatest joys we have is at the end of the season when we're actually to take these bats that we've had in care for months. So, you do get to know them. And one of the best feelings is to be able to let them go and watch them fly and know that they're back out there. That's the main reason we do what we're doing.
It must be so rewarding. All right. Thank you both.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kathy.
And thank you for listening. As always, drop me a line if you have a question about something you hear in an episode of Wild About Wildlife, or if you have an idea for a future episode. You can reach me at wildaboutwildlife@salthaven.org. You can find Wild About Wildlife on Google, Spotify, and Apple. Don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can keep the wild in wildlife.